Hello and welcome, this is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In today's video, I'm going to create some layered flowers cards. Now these are all layered flower die sets from Lisa Horton Crafts. There are 4 different ones here that I'm going to be using. We have the Echinacea, the Fantasy Flower, there's Anemone, and then there's also Magnolia. I'm also going to be using 2 different premium paper packs from her as well that are new. And they are the Shabby Chic as well as the Splash of Color. Now this is the Shabby Chic one here. There are lots of different papers in this set, and I love the fact that there are faux wood grain ones and then some faux distressed ones. These sheets are all about 5.5 by 8.5. One, I think it's 5 1/4 by 8.5. Or 5.5 by 8 1/4. I measured it yesterday, but I forget. This one here is the Splash of Color. So there are different solids in between ones that look a little bit watercolor or alcohol inky. So they're a fun way to get that look without having to create that look on your own. So when you get Lisa Horton Crafts die sets, they come on a piece of cardstock that has some really sticky tape. What I like to do is I bought a huge pack of adhesive magnet sheets. I cut my magnet sheets down to the size of the cardboard that comes with the die, and once I've taken all the dies off of there, I put some magnet sheet on there so that anytime I'm using that die, it makes it really easy to take it off of that card and reuse it. I just find it very helpful for the future that I'm not playing around and messing around with that tape. So I'm going to do the Magnolia layered flower first. I have them die cut out of some of the papers from the Shabby Chic Premium Cardstock. I love the fact that you can use these cardstocks as background papers, or you can die cut them and use them in your crafts as well. Now I'm mixing and matching some of the Shabby Chic with the Splash of Color ones for some of the cards. I just really focused on the colors and chose ones that were going to go well with the colors that I had chosen for the flowers. And I wanted to use them for both the flowers as well as my backgrounds. So I did a little bit of ink blending with this one. I used 2 different Cloud 9 matte blending inks. I used the Loganberry for the flowers. It's a nice kind of almost a dusty rose, but it has a little bit of a darker tone to it. And then I used the Garden Sage for the greenery. I'm using my Tacky Mat to hold those die cuts down while I'm doing that ink blending. And I'm going to be doing a lot of ink blending throughout this video with those papers as well as with some other papers. So once I'm done doing my ink blending, I can layer them together, and these flowers are really easy to figure out how they layer together. I'm using some Barely Art glue in a fine line bottle. I like using a liquid glue because it gives me a few seconds to shimmy and move things in place and make sure it's perfectly positioned, and then it starts to grab the paper fairly quickly and it doesn't warp the paper. I haven't had any of the paper warping at all, which I also love. I like to use a large acrylic block to put those pieces under while they are drying. Keeps them nice and flat, and it frees up my hands to be working on the next piece. Once I have all of those florals done, layered, and ready to go, I can start assembling my card. I am going to clean off my mat in between using it just to make sure that there's no ink residue left over there. I always have a damp cloth in my craft room to do that with, just keep cleaning as I'm going. So I am layering these 2 printed papers onto my white card base. I like to use white card bases often because they're nice and inexpensive and they pretty much go with anything. I cut the larger of the 2 pieces to 5 3/8 by 4 1/8, and the smaller one is 5 1/4 by 4 inches. So there's a really narrow mat around it. Because I hadn't created with these dies before, I wasn't sure on how large they were going to be, and I really could have made that inner one a little bit smaller to just kind of make it a little bit more cozy and have a little bit less space around it, but I really love that background as well. Once I had those layers down, I can start gluing my flowers down. I glue the greenery down first and then add the flowers in the different spots. Sometimes I'll follow the placement on the front of the dies, and sometimes I won't. Sometimes I'll change it up because I want a little bit of a different look, or I want certain flowers in certain places. For the sentiments for all of the cards that I'm doing today, I'm using that A Little Hello die set. It's a collaboration between Lisa Horton Crafts and Spellbinders. It came out a couple months ago. I've used them in videos before, and I love the fact that you can do 2 layers for the hello, or you can do 3 layers. So it gives you a lot of opportunity to get creative. I die cut 1 out of the green print that I'm using on the background, and then I die cut 1 out of the pink print that I used for the florals, and did a little bit of ink blending on the bottom just to give them a bit of a shadow and a little bit more interest. Gluing them on top of each other and just gluing them over top of the bottom of the stem for that magnolia. Now, because these papers have a matte finish and my inks have a matte finish, it's pretty matte looking. It's pretty flat looking. So for the next cards, I'm going to be adding some shimmer through the use of Cloud9 Interference ink pads, as well as some stickles and glossy accents when appropriate for whichever card I'm doing. So the next card I'm creating is the Anemone one. This is the layered Anemone die. I chose a blue color of the cardstock from one of the paper packs. It's either the Shabby Chic Premium Cardstock pack or the Splash of Color. I think the blue one was from the Splash of Color, but like I said before, I intermixed both of them. I was looking more at the colors and not keeping them within the same packs. And I love the fact that there are so many different prints to choose from. So I did my inking on the flower with some Opal Blush Cloud9 Interference ink. This one is blue on light cardstock and has a pink shimmer on dark cardstock, but because these cardstocks are all light, we're going to see the dye part of the ink more, and then when you tilt it in the light, we're going to see just a tiny bit of shimmer from that interference. On the greenery, I used Summer Garden. That one has more green to it on light cardstocks, and then it'll have a little bit of a blue shimmer. And then I did a touch of Regal Gray on one of the parts for the center of the flower, just to give it a little bit of different color in the center. And that Regal Gray is going to look more gray, but when you tilt it in the light, it has a little bit of a purple shimmer to it. So I love the fact that we can take advantage of the dye properties of these ink pads, but still have a little bit of texture and sparkle shine from that interference property. And the interference is kind of like mica powder. It looks a little bit sometimes like perfect pearls in certain areas, but it's within an ink pad form, so it just applies a little bit different. And it's one of my favorite ink pads to play with. I have a whole playlist on my channel here, so if you want to see more ways of it being used, that's a good place to go, because I use it quite a lot. I think it's like magic in a pad, I swear. So because I had used my Tacky Mat to do my ink blending on, I decided to assemble my flowers on the pad, or on the Tacky Mat. I'm going to be doing it off of the mat after this, because I did find it was a little bit harder to pick up some of the pieces, only because they were just they were tacking or whatever to that mat a little bit. So I decided to try this, but after this I'll be doing it just on my working surface, because I do prefer that. I'm using some reverse tweezers to hold those tiny little bits in place. There are really tiny pieces for the details for this flower, and by using a pair of reverse tweezers, I can hold them in one hand, swap that tweezer to the next hand, and not have to be squeezing it in order to hold that piece. In order to release the paper, I squeeze it to release it. So I find it quite handy for crafting, especially with tiny pieces. It just keeps your fingers out of the glue. I tend to be a little bit of a klutz and tend to make a little bit of a mess. So if I were holding these all in my fingers, I would likely get glue all over the place, and then my fingers would get sticky and it would be harder to hold the other pieces. So tweezers like this are a tool that I use often, especially with tiny little pieces. I don't find they're necessary when you have larger pieces, tiny pieces, and I also find them very helpful for layering sentiments, because you can hold that whole sentiment and then hover it above the shadow beneath it, and I find it makes it a little bit easier for me anyways for placement. Once I have all of my flowers layered together, I can take them off of that Tacky Mat. I can give it a wipe off and let that dry before I knead it again. And then we can start assembling those pieces onto the front of the card. Now I'm using some matte blending inks as well as those interference inks. They will start to stain that Tacky Mat. It's just going to happen with, especially with the dye properties of those ink pads, dyes stain. But I am of the impression, or I feel that I would much rather have a craft supply stained because it's been used and loved than something in pristine condition because you are afraid to use it because it stains. So I do try to clean things off, but if it stains, I don't mind that. The only time I ever mind it is if it affects the use of it. And for the things that I have that are stained, it has never affected the use of it. So to give a little bit of texture to the background for this particular card, I'm using the Leafy Flourish embossing folder. This one is also from Lisa Horton Crafts, and I've done a previous video and I have another video on it. I'm not sure if that one will be published before this one gets published. I just did that embossing on that background and did a tiny light bit of ink blending with that Summer Garden interference pad just towards the center of the leaves. I wanted to highlight them a little bit more and give a little bit more of a greeny look to that background, just to show off that texture, but I didn't want it to be overpowering. So I did very light ink blending. So I used a very, very light hand. Easier to add a little bit more pressure and a little bit more ink if you want it darker than to get too dark to start with and have it overpower everything. With that ink blended, I can start assembling my flowers. And because all of those layered flowers are already layered together, it's really easy to assemble and put the card together. It came together so quickly. It's just a matter of adding glue and then laying it onto the front of the card. Once I have everything laid in place, I can put that acrylic block on there, set that aside for that glue to set just a little bit. I have a blue mat here that I was going to use around the card, but then as I was inking my flowers, I decided to use that Opal blush pad and have it tie in just a little bit better with the flowers on the card. The other thing I did off screen was ink the center of that piece and then die cut one of my hellos from it. By die cutting out of the center of the pieces of cardstock that you're going to be using as mats, they are going to be covered by the upper layers, so you're never going to know that anything was cut out of them, and it just makes your cardstock go a little bit farther. I don't do this when it's just regular cardstock, but I do this when it's specialty papers or papers that I have a limited supply on. I just like making it last just a little bit longer and using pieces that you wouldn't see anyways. So off screen, I die cut that hello, and I also die cut a piece of solid cardstock to go behind it just to give it a little bit of extra dimension. And then I'm gluing that onto the front of the card. And I love the look of that interference shimmer on the mat behind it, as well as the flowers and that hello. To finish off the center of the flowers, I just used a touch of stickles and then let them dry. Stickles are a glitter glue that come in a bottle with a fine tip, so you can get even a fine amount there. And I really love using them for the centers of flowers. It just kind of gives the card a little bit of a sparkle, gives that center of the flower just a little bit of a focal point, and changes up the texture on your cards just a little bit. For the third card, I'm using the Echinacea die. I die cut a bunch of the flowers out of different colors of cardstock from the Splash of Color pad. I'm also using some papers from the Shabby Chic pad here as well. I really liked the distressed looking backgrounds, but I love the colors on the Splash of Color papers. Now, to give this a little bit of shine and a little bit more deepness to the color, I'm using the Lavender Fields interference pad. I'm not ink blending the entire pieces or the entire pieces from the flowers. I'm just going from the center of the flower and just kind of flicking my brush out. So we still get the regular cardstock around the outside, but we have that interference on the inside. Again, once everything is ink blended, I can put it to the side, and I like to layer or place everything how they're going to be layered together so that I have all of my pieces together. I know what goes with what, and I don't get a little bit confused with a pile of pieces. I also use that same Summer Garden interference pad to do just a touch of ink blending on the greenery. For that one, I started at the base of the flower or the base of the greenery and just kind of flicked my way up. Once again, I didn't ink the entire thing. I want a little bit of that dye-based ink to add a little bit of shadow, and I also want just a little bit of that interference for the shimmer of it. Set that to the side as well to dry. Cleaned my mat off so that that can start drying for my next card, and then we're assembling the flowers. And these flowers are all really easy to assemble and to know what layer goes next, and I love the fact that they are so easy to assemble. For most of my cards, I'm just using one of each of the flowers. There's the odd time where I added an extra one or I die cut an extra one. The last card, I do one of each size for the flowers, and then I do one of the, or actually three of the smallest size, but we'll get to that later. For the little buds here, there is a solid piece that I have for the back. I have a little tiny ink blended piece for the top of that bud. And then there's a green piece for the base of it. And they all get glued onto that solid piece. So it makes it a lot easier to have everything in one spot when you're assembling your card. With all of the flowers layered together, I can start assembling. Now, after doing a couple cards, I realized that I have a little bit of extra room. So I cut this piece down. I think I cut this one down to 4 inches by 5. No, that one was 3 3/4 by 5 inches. My white piece here, I'm cutting to 4 inches by 5 1/4. And I'm going to use the Lavender Fields Interference ink pad and just ink around the edges. Because this is a matte, it just needs to be just around the edges. If I do it in the center, it's typically because I want to die cut a sentiment out of it as well. But if you're just using it for a matte around the edges, it just needs to be around that edge. There's no point in putting a bunch of ink in the center if you're only going to cover it up completely and you don't have a use for it. So once that ink had dried, and these ink pads, the interference pads, are really juicy, so I do want to let them dry and make sure that I'm not transferring ink onto my fingers or onto other things. I can glue that to the card base, set that aside to dry with that acrylic block on top of it. And then my Shabby Chic piece for my background, I decided to use a little bit of that Summer Garden interference pad and just do some light ink blending on the outside. And I am making sure that it is not even in any way, because this background kind of has a distressed look to it. I want my ink blending to look like that as well. So I want some areas where it's a little bit thicker, some areas where it's a little bit thinner. The point of this is to kind of blend in with the style of that print of paper, as well as to get a little bit of that green in there and a little bit of that shimmer around the outside to tie in with the greenery on the piece that's going on the front. Once I have my background how I like, I can put that to the side, clean my mat off, and then I can start putting it onto my card once it's dried. And because I use so very little ink here, it really doesn't take that long for that one to dry at all. Most of it dried before I even got it off the mat. But I really love the combination of the matte printed paper with that shimmer from that interference pad around it. I really love the combination of those two. So this die cut has 2 different greenery pieces. So I die cut both of them, ink blended both of them, and I'm going to glue them so that it kind of looks like one comes out of the other. So I just checked my placement on top of the acrylic block before actually gluing it in place. By doing it on the top of the acrylic block, I can see it on the background, but I'm not interfering with anything drying beneath it. And then I can start to add my flowers. I have the 2 flowers that are die cut from the background, as well as the 2 buds. I did die cut and assemble a 3rd bud off screen because I realized there was an extra stem that wasn't going to have a bud and it was going to look a little bit odd. So here's one where I did a different placement for the buds and the flowers. Again, you can do it however it's going to work for what you're creating. There doesn't need to be a certain way for each of those flowers, and I am choosing different colors for some of the flowers than that is on the front of the package, and sometimes I'm choosing similar colors. And I love the fact that these flowers are stylized enough that you can just get creative with the colors. You don't have to worry about whether it's supposed to be that color or not. Just have fun. So for this one, I did the layered hello, and then I also chose one of the sub-sentiments that goes with this die set as well. There's a few sub-sentiments that I had already had stamped and die cut that I am using for the last 2 cards, just to give a little bit of a different look and have it not just say a plain hello like the first 2. To finish off the center of the flowers, once again, I'm using just a little bit of stickles to add that sparkle to the center. At this point, they're not totally dry, but they can be drying off while I'm working on the next card. Now you may notice that I keep bringing these containers in. I like to do all my die cutting before a video if appropriate, off screen, and I use my medium craft stacks to hold them all in place. This way I can have everything divided between the different cards, and it keeps everything organized. When I'm ready to work on a certain project or a certain card, I can just bring that container in and I have everything already done, ready to go, and it just makes the process run a little bit smoother. So once again, I'm using my Tacky Mat. This time, however, I die cut all of the pieces out of white cardstock. This is one of my most favorite techniques to do with the Cloud9 interference pads. I die cut it out of white. I'll use some black ink to do a little bit of black or a little bit of ink blending. And I will do this where I typically would do some shading. So this way I get to highlight both of the colors that come out of the pad. Now, what I'm playing around with here on the mat is there's some really, really tiny pieces for the bases of the flowers. I'm trying to ink blend them black. I should have just die cut them in black cardstock and then didn't have to worry about ink blending them. It works out totally fine, but they do like to stick to those brushes. Once I have all of that black ink blending done, and you can see that each one of those die cuts has a black area and a white area and then a kind of a transition in between. I am moving these pieces and taking or wiping that black ink off of my mat. I now want to use that interference pad, and I don't want to contaminate any of my pads with that black ink. I want to make sure to keep them as pristine as possible. So I do go in and I clean off my mat to take off as much of that excess of black ink as possible. I will give it a few moments for that ink or for the wetness from the mat from wiping it off to dry before I start on the next step. So on the bottom of the mat here, I have the 3 different sizes of flowers, and on the right top side of the mat, I have 3 sets of the smallest flowers. Now, if you look at the front of this fantasy flower die set, you can see that you can use it for the flowers, but you can also use it to create butterflies. And I think that's just genius to be able to use it in those ways. So I have those 3 at the top there. I'm going to do an open butterfly as well as a closed butterfly, just for something a little bit different. Once again, I'm using interference pads here. This one that I'm using right now is called Sweet Treat. So it's going to look yellow on the white cardstock, and then on the black, it's going to have a bit of a pink interference look to it. So a pink shimmery look on the black. So by doing the black ink blending, I can highlight both of those properties of those pads, and I absolutely love the way it looks. It just, to me, it's like magic. Being able to see how that pad, it looks completely different on the dark than it does on the light. On the greenery, I use that same Summer Garden, the green that goes blue on the black. And now I'm using some peacock tails for the flowers. That's going to make the flowers look blue, and then on the black areas, it's going to look more purple. For most of these, I'm using just detailed ink blending brushes. It's just because that's what I had for that particular pad. I go with a label maker and I label every brush that I'm using with these interference pads because I don't want to mix them up. Every single one of those pads has a different dye base and a different shimmer color. So for me, the best way to do it is have a brush dedicated to each one of those pads. And eventually I'll have a regular ink blending brush plus a detailed ink blending brush for each one of the pads. But at the moment, it just depends on what I'm doing, if I have excess brushes and whatnot. The other option, you could clean your brushes off in between projects and let them dry. This is just easier for me, and I find that those brushes are not super expensive, so I'll just buy several packs at a time every once in a while. For those butterflies, I used the Tropical Paradise pad, so that's going to show pink on the white cardstock, and then it has like a bluey purpley color on the black or the dark piece. With everything inked, I can start assembling my cards or my pieces. So right now I'm assembling those flowers, and it's really easy to see exactly where everything assembles. Once again, you can use the front of the packaging if you're in doubt, but most of these pieces go from largest to smallest, so it's really easy to see exactly where everything goes. And that really tiny piece just goes at the base of the flower. So the tiny piece there, I found it easiest to put some glue down where it's supposed to go and then use a jewel picker just to pick up that piece and then place it. This one here is going to be one of the butterflies. So I'm going to do 2 flowers as they're supposed to be created, and then I'm going to put the small parts together and then glue that tiny little centerpiece to be the center part of the body, and then I'm going to let that dry. Now at this point I've just got those cardstocks butted together, so they're not necessarily very secure, but I am going to let that glue set for a few moments, and then when it comes time to gluing my card together, it'll still be a little bit flexible, but once I have that glued down, it'll be nice and secure. For my mat for this one, I'm using that Tropical Paradise. I love that bright pink. It's just so nice and vibrant. And then I'm taking my Hello die cut. I did that one in white cardstock as well, doing that same ink blending with the black ink, moving it to a different part, and then using that same Tropical Paradise ink pad. And you could use whatever colors you're wanting for both the matte as well as the Hello. I chose to use the Tropical Paradise one because there is less of the pink in my finished product, and I thought it would be nice for tying all of that together. With all of that ink blending done, it's time to start assembling my card. So I've got my white card base here. We can glue down our sentiment. Now you'll see I did ink the center because originally I was going to just do a pink sentiment, and then I thought with the black ink blending that I did for the rest of the florals that it would be a nice way that doing the same thing on the Hello would be a nice way to tie it in. So I changed my mind and just did a white die cut and then did the ink blending. Again, you can do whatever you want. The other way would have still looked great. There's nothing wrong with it. But I just thought the idea of the same type of ink blending for my sentiment as my flowers and foliage would be nice. So now I glued down the greenery, and this one I die cut the greenery twice. I wanted it to be a little bit more full behind there. I love the wood background behind there. It's just a nice neutral background, but it just gives it a little bit of interest with those little wood slats as well. You could easily just do solid cardstock or a solid color behind there as well, but I really like just that neutral color behind the bright, vibrant colors. And because this one is called Fantasy Flower, I figured blue flowers is absolutely perfect for that. So with the flowers and my sentiment down, now is a good time to glue down that sub-sentiment and then place my butterflies. I always like to put my flowers down first before trying to figure out where the butterflies go, because they're a good thing to fill in some of the open areas. Then I put my half butterfly or my side profile butterfly, and I love the look of the two of them together on there. I think it's absolutely adorable. In the process, I lost my little tiny piece for that smaller butterfly. I put on one that I had die cut or I had colored, and I did it I think in pink, and with it on there it looked a little bit odd, so I went and did it in a different color. I just did the black on it and it looked a little bit better. To finish this off, I'm using some stickles on the flower centers as well as the outline of the butterfly wings. I do want the stickles different on the butterflies than they are on the flowers. If I did the stickles in the same spot on both of them, I think it would look like I just had some pink and some blue flowers. So I wanted that a little bit different. And then for a little bit of a different texture on the little butterfly bodies, I just did some glossy accents just to add that little bit of shine and once again make it look a little bit different than the flowers. I absolutely love playing with all of these different layering flowers dies, and I love incorporating those interference inks with those printed papers as well. Again, you could do just regular matte ink blending or matte blending inks for them, but I love the look of the different textures in them. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you spending your time with me. I hope you have a fantastic day.